With this legislation, we're fulfilling the mandate we were entrusted with last November and setting our country and the American people up to be safer, stronger, and more prosperous. I look forward to the House taking up and passing this historic legislation and getting it to the President's desk.
Today's vote will haunt our Republican colleagues for years to come as the American people see the damage that is done, as hospitals close, as people are laid off, as costs go up, as the debt increases. They will see what our colleagues have done, and they will remember it. And we Democrats will make sure they remember it. The American people will not forget the betrayal that took place today.
Well, I just heard that about the Senate, and the bill just passed, and it tells you there's something for everyone. I mean, it's a great bill. There is something for everyone, and I think it's going to go very nicely in the House. Actually, I think it will be easier in the House than it was in the Senate.
President Trump reacting to the Senate's narrow passage of that massive domestic policy bill yesterday. It now heads back to the House, where hardline conservatives say they have enough votes to sink that legislation. Also ahead this morning, President Trump tours a controversial new migrant detention camp in the middle of the Florida Everglades. We'll have the latest on so-called alligator Alcatraz. Plus, the jury in the Sean Diddy Combs sex trafficking trial will resume deliberations in just a few hours after announcing in court yesterday it reached a partial verdict, with one still dangling out there. We'll have legal analysis on what it all means. Good morning. Welcome to Morning Joe. It is Wednesday, July 2nd. I'm Willie Geist, with us, U.S. Special Correspondent for BBC News and host of the Rest is Politics podcast, Katty Kay. Also the host of Way Too Early, Ali Vitale, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and MSNBC political analyst Eugene Robinson, and senior writer for The Dispatch, David Drucker. He's also a Bloomberg columnist. A great panel assembled. Good morning to you all to talk about this. The Senate yesterday passing President Trump's signature tax and domestic policy bill. The vote, 51 to 50. That 51 came from Vice President J.D. Vance, who broke the tie after three Republican senators, Susan Collins of Maine, Rand Paul of Kentucky, and Thom Tillis of North Carolina, joined every Democrat in opposing the legislation. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, who had expressed concerns throughout the process about cuts to social programs, was the key vote for Senate Majority Leader John Thune to win over, and he did just that. More on Senator Murkowski in just a moment. The revised legislation now heads back to the House, where Speaker Mike Johnson will attempt to get it passed before President Trump's self-imposed and arbitrary 4th of July deadline. That's Friday. Several House Republicans are already lining up to oppose the legislation. It would take just 3 of them to sink it. Congressman Ralph Norman, member of the conservative House Freedom Caucus, says he believes there are enough no votes to stop it from passing. So let's pause right there before we get into the contents of this Senate version of the bill. And Ali, you were running around Capitol Hill all day yesterday on your beat. So let's talk for a minute about how they got these final votes, specifically from Senator Lisa Murkowski, who took great pains yesterday to talk about how agonizing this process was, how agonizing the vote was, and how terrible, she says, the process of reconciliation is to arrive at legislation. How did Republicans do it?
Yeah, agonizing is the word that she used to describe this process. And we know that she had various priorities that she wanted in this bill that ultimately fell out. Her central goal was to protect Alaskans from this legislation. And we've seen Murkowski be able to put her very specific Alaska stamp on other major pieces of Republican legislation in the past. Certainly this one is no different. But I thought it was so striking the way that Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, who was consistently a no vote on this, said that basically all of the other states in this country are now going to have to suffer for a piece of legislation that was negotiated, he used the word pork, because of Alaska and because of Murkowski and getting her vote on board. She obviously took great umbrage to that. There's a great clip where she stares down our Capitol Hill correspondent as he asks about that comment from Senator Paul. But I think it just goes to show the deep tension here, but also I would say the Senate passage actually says less to me about the power of Trump and Trumpism than it does about the specific negotiations within this bill to get key senators on board. When you look at someone like Susan Collins, The reason that they weren't able to get her, I think, is very closely tied to the fact that she's going to be on the ballot again in 2026. And she is in one of the most rural states in the country that would see its hospital system deeply harmed by this legislation. In my conversation with sources close to her yesterday, that's what they kept saying to me time and again, that the rural hospitals piece of this, the millions of people who could lose their health care, tens of thousands of them in Maine, that all factored in very closely to Collins' calculus. For Murkowski, she was clearly able to get a little bit more of what she needed to get to yes here. But I also think it's really stunning to see her say that even as she votes yes, she wants the House to realize that this is not a perfect piece of legislation. And I think if they were to hold a vote right now, which they're not going to for a lot of reasons, they would not have the votes on it. And it's going to be a very interesting 24 to 48 hours to see the way that Speaker Johnson cobbles together this coalition once again. It was a tight squeeze the last time. It's going to be even tighter this time.
Yeah, even after voting yes, Senator Murkowski talked about how undignified the entire process was and said out loud she hopes the House changes this and basically picks it apart and sends back a different version. So Senator Susan Collins of Maine yesterday released a statement writing in part, "My vote against this bill stems primarily from the harmful impact it will have on Medicaid, affecting low-income families and rural health care providers like our hospitals and nursing homes." Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, who also voted no, had this to say yesterday.
A couple of weeks ago, I offered to extend the debt ceiling for 3 months, which is about $500 billion. I offered that again. And there was a time in which they had to make a decision dealing with me and reducing the debt ceiling or giving pork and subsidies to Alaska. They chose to add more pork and subsidies for Alaska to secure that vote.
Senator Paul there referring to Republican Senator Murkowski of Alaska. NBC News chief Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles asked Murkowski about her colleague's criticism.
Senator Paul said that that your vote was a bailout for Alaska at the expense of the rest of the country.
Oh my God.
That's what Senator Paul said.
My question was easy. Senator, we've got the...
I didn't say it, ma'am. I'm just asking for your response.
My response is I have an obligation to the people of the state of Alaska. When people suggest that federal dollars go to one of our 50 states in a, quote, bailout, I find that offensive. Do I like this bill? No, because I tried to take care of Alaska's interests. But I know that in many parts of the country, there are Americans that are not going to be advantaged by this bill. I don't like that.
A little stare down there from Senator Murkowski. Maybe she was just thinking about it. In a written statement, Senator Murkowski said, "This was one of the hardest votes I've taken during my time in the Senate. Let's not kid ourselves. This has been an awful process. A frantic rush to meet an artificial deadline that has tested every limit of this institution. While we have worked to improve the present bill for Alaska, it is not good enough for the rest of our nation, and we all know it." End quote. Murkowski also told reporters deciding to vote for the package was agonizing, as we mentioned, adding she hopes her colleagues in the House realize the bill needs more work and demand changes before passing it. So, David Drucker, focusing on Lisa Murkowski here, but let's look at now where this lands in the House. You've got members of the Freedom Caucus, as Ali pointed out, who've said they're just not going to vote for it in its present form, that it needs big changes. There's a whole question about getting everybody into Washington, all kinds of thunderstorms and travel delays. Every vote counts in this process. And a deadline of Friday, the 4th of July, set by President Trump. Speaker Johnson said yesterday, we're going to get to it. We're going to get this thing done by the 4th of July. A massive bill that needs all kinds of revisions and debates and votes. How do you see this playing out from here in the Republican caucus?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. I wouldn't put too much stock in members of the House Republican Conference saying that they've got the votes to stop this thing. They might have the votes to stop it for a couple of days, until President Trump calls them, works them over, and they look at the momentum behind the bill, having gotten this far, and ultimately I expect they'll roll over one way or the other. Now, I've always thought that July 4th was a bit of an ambitious deadline, that the August recess, meaning the end of July, beginning of August, before members depart Washington for about 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the calendar, every year. I thought that always made a lot more sense. But I think that at the end of the day, if this was going to be a debt reduction exercise, this bill would have looked a lot different. There's just not a lot of support among Republican voters to do that. As you've seen, most of the tension here, whether from conservatives or centrists, has been about the Medicaid cuts. And even though the so-called fiscal hawks have made a lot of noise about stopping the bill, every chance they've had to stop the bill, they've found a way not to stop the bill. And so, I think there's going to be a lot of sturm and dram from the Freedom Caucus among House Republicans talking about how this thing doesn't have the votes. Maybe they do want to make changes. Maybe they will make some changes. We could see a little ping pong action here, but this thing is going to pass. The question is just how long this process is going to be drawn out.
Yeah, as you say, we've seen this movie before, and it nearly always ends the same. Republicans bending to the will of President Trump.